Have you ever been moved to a conversation wheel as if your presence was just physical, but your mind was elsewhere? This sensation, which many see as a sign of shyness or arrogance, can hide something deeper. Nikola Tesla, for example, was known for avoiding parties, meetings, and any kind of social agitation. He preferred the company of his thoughts, his projects, his ideas. For him, the noise of the world hindered creation, and he was not the only one. Isaac Newton was isolated for days, plunged into his studies, almost indifferent to what was happening around. Emily Dickinson, one of the greatest poets in the English language, lived practically reclined in her home, refusing visits, but writing verses of unusual depth. These names did not stand out only for their genius, but also for their choice, or perhaps need, to live on the fringes of social life. Solitude, in these cases, does not appear as weakness, but as a kind of fuel for the mind that works in silence. And it is at this point that an inevitable question arises. Is social removal not often the fertile soil where the greatest ideas are born? Schopenhauer believed yes, and this conviction shaped all its philosophy. Genius, he said, does not bloom in the midst of noise, but in introspection. And the greater the mind, the greater the difficulty of finding company at height. For many, this silence would be a burden. For the geniuses, a gift. For Arthur Schopenhauer, loneliness was not a choice made by whim or misanthropy. It was an inevitable consequence of intellectual elevation. In his work, The World as Will and Representation, he states that the ordinary human being lives guided by blind desires, momentary passions, and incessant search for distractions. Already the individual of a high spirit, by realizing this superficial structure of social life, feels naturally removed from it. He is not isolated because he despises others, isolates because the world that surrounds him seems small in the face. Of the vastness of his reflections, living with most people, for Schopenhauer, tends to stifle deep thought. The conversations become boring, the exchanges of ideas shallow. Everything is reduced to appearances, status, vanities, repetitions. In this scenario, the thinker sees himself as a stranger, not for arrogance but for incompatibility of interests. While most are concerned with banalities, he seeks to understand the essence of reality, the structure of human suffering, the nature of existence. Schopenhauer went straight to stating, "A man can only be himself while he is alone." And he added with another provocation, "If it does not love loneliness, will it not love freedom? For only when one is alone, it is truly free." For him, isolation is not an exile, but a shelter. It is there, far from the collective agitation, that the mind finds space to grow, explore, produce. And that's why, throughout history, so many bright figures have come to the same way. Not because they were cold or antisocial, but because their inner world was richer and more complex than they found outside. Intellectual superiority, according to Schopenhauer, creates a natural barrier between the thinker and the rest of society. This is not an elitist choice, but a real difference of interests, depth, and worldview. For him, the more one understands life widely, the more he realizes the distance between his way of thinking and that of the majority. This gap is manifested in everyday life in the form of disconnection, frustration, or boredom in the face of common interactions. While many enter conversations about appearances, trivial events, or recognition disputes, the reflective mind feels displaced, almost suffocated. The thinker is not satisfied with the superficial. He seeks meaning, truth, structure, and when trying to share this search with others, it often finds indifference or misunderstanding. This generates an inevitable removal, not because he finds himself better, but because the surrounding conversations don't feed what his mind needs. Schopenhauer watched that the genius sees the mediocrity of society, but cannot dialogue with it without being injured in its authenticity. He does not despise the other for free. He just feels that there is no room for his deepest ideas in social theater. This does not mean that loneliness is easy. On the contrary, it can be heavy, melancholy, even cruel. But for the most lucid, living among continuous distractions can be even more painful. In this context, social disconnection is not a failure but a feature of lucidity. It is a symptom of thought that goes beyond the obvious and is no longer satisfied with the surface. Solitude in this context is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it protects the deep mind from external noise contamination. On the other hand, it charges a high price. Schopenhauer knew that. He did not romanticize the isolation naively. He acknowledged that this choice, or destination, could lead to melancholy, disenchantment, the feeling of being permanently dislocated in the world. Freedom of thinking without interference is accompanied by the pain of not being understood, of not belonging anywhere. This paradox appears in almost all the great intellectual figures of history. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, wrote in So Zarathustra that the philosopher is like an hermit who descends from the mountain to share his wisdom, but finds rejection and mockery. The isolation for him was the price of clarity. The more anyone sees, the more lonely becomes. Seeing more than others is also supporting the pain of being invisible to them. But there is an important difference between voluntary loneliness and the loneliness imposed. The first is chosen consciously, as a search for introspection, autonomy, depth. The second is born of the contempt of others, from social exclusion, the resentment of mediocrity, as Nietzsche called the impulse of the mass of rejecting what it does not understand. In this second case, the thinker not only isolates himself, he is also pushed out. And this is perhaps the greatest tragedy of lonely genius. It is not just the distance he takes from society, but the impossibility of building significant bridges with it. Even if you try, your themes scare, your silence bothers you, your intensity seems exaggeration. He speaks a language that few understand. And gradually, the world is moving away, or he retreats by tiredness, for disappointment. Solitude then becomes a kind of chosen but also supported exile, a place where the thinker finds freedom but also carries the weight of knowing that full understanding is sometimes unreachable. In this ambiguous territory between peace and anguish is the most powerful ideas flourish. It is there in silence that screams that the thought that transforms the world is born, even if the world, for a long time, insists on ignoring it. Over the centuries, isolation has not only been a common trait, but a kind of trademark between great names in science, philosophy, and art. Not coincidentally, but because loneliness seemed to offer them a deep construction space, a place where thinking did not need to defend themselves, where ideas could be cultivated without the interference of the eyes of others. And this pattern repeats itself in personalities that have changed the course of history. Nikola Tesla spent much of her life alone in hotel rooms, completely involved in experiments that seemed to be decades ahead of her time. It was reserved, eccentric, almost unattainable. He avoided social meetings not for shyness, but for considering them useless distractions in the face of the vastness of what was going on inside his head. It made no point in applause or approval, sought the invisible. And on this lonely path, he built the foundations of the modern world. Emily Dickinson turned her home and her room into a creative sanctuary. He refused invitations, isolated even from family and close friends, and there, between four walls, he wrote poems that crossed generations. She didn't live in the world, but reinvented him inside. His writing was born from silence, and silence was his main interlocutor. Beethoven, realizing the approaching deafness, did not surrender to the tragedy. On the contrary, it closed even more in its inner universe and, at this time of greater isolation, produced some of the most intense and revolutionary compositions in the history of music. His pain did not destroy him. Solitude did not silence him. On the contrary, it expanded your voice. Isaac Newton, during the plague that plagued England in the 17th century, was forced to move away from university and to take refuge in the countryside. During this period, without distractions, far from public debates, he developed the basis of modern physics. It was not in the crowd, but in absolute imprisonment, that gravity gained theoretical form. These stories are not just biographical curiosities. They reveal something deep. Loneliness, when chosen as a path of deepening and not as an escape from the world, can become a fertile territory. It is in this silence that thought matures. It is in removal that the mind finds its own frequency. And that sheds light on what Schopenhauer tried to say, that perhaps genius requires space. Not only physical space, but existential space. An interval between being and the world. A distance that does not nullifies life, but deepens it. These geniuses were not just alone. They were in communion with what no one else could see, and perhaps this is the true price of lucidity. Schopenhauer understood loneliness as inevitability, but also as a strategic choice. For him, the true thinker did not need to completely exile from society, but should learn to navigate it without dragging on. This required a kind of detachment that went beyond simple indifference. It was a philosophical posture, being in the world without belonging to it, observing without absorbing, listening without contaminating. This detachment is not cold, it is clarity. It is not about rejecting people completely, but about understanding their boundaries without frustration. Schopenhauer saw social coexistence as a play, with predefined papers, carefully maintained masks, and repetitive dialogues. The problem for him was not living in itself, but in the superficiality that usually dominates it. It was possible to be present without being arrested, participate without getting too involved. This same attitude is echoed in Stoicism. Marco Aurelio, emperor and philosopher, wrote in his Meditations that the secret of inner peace was to accept what cannot be controlled and focus on what depends on himself. For him, it made no sense to suffer from the behavior of others. It was wiser to preserve one's integrity in the face of the confusion of the world. Wisdom consisted of keeping the mind firm, even in the midst of chaos. In practice, this philosophy translates to knowing how to select with those sharing thought, to refuse the need for approval, to avoid the emotional dependence on the opinions of others. It is to find pleasure to reflect alone, to walk unaccompanied without feeling incomplete, to accept that not every conversation needs to be deep, and not every connection essential. Schopenhauer believed that the high man should cultivate a certain serene distance, not complete isolation, but a strategic presence. He suggested minimal but well-chosen interactions, few conversations but significant, few ties but true. The goal was not to disappear, but to preserve itself. In times of social networks, constant exposure, urgent by belonging, this lesson becomes even more relevant. No need to move away from the world to protect the mind, but we need to learn to preserve yourself within it. Detachment is not the absence of feeling, it is a presence of consciousness, and this is what differentiates the deep thinker from the one who only reacts to what surrounds him. While one is shaped by the world, the other chooses to shape its own way of being in it. We reach the most delicate point of the journey, loneliness as an ambiguous experience. For some, she is shelter. For others, an almost unbearable weight. Schopenhauer via loneliness as a privilege granted to those who carry within themselves a deep, inappropriate mind to the rhythm of the crowd. But he also recognized that this privilege was accompanied by a silent pain, the pain of not being understood, of walking through mental landscapes where few dare or can go. Even the great thinkers who embraced the isolation did not come out unharmed. Emily Dickinson suffered intense crises of anguish and discouragement. Nietzsche, no matter how much he exalted the strength of loneliness, wrote pages and more pages about the suffering of being only in the face of truth. Tesla, in her last years, plunged into an almost fanciful universe, talking to pigeons and fighting for oblivion. Solitude fed its genius, but also charged a high price of its sanity. This reveals that loneliness is not by itself a virtue or poison. It is an open field, a space that can generate fruits and generate ghosts. The difference is how to deal with her. When it is lived with purpose, consciousness, with internal cultivation, it becomes freedom. When it is imposed, misunderstood, or lived as an escape, it can become jail. The brilliant mind, in this sense, needs to learn to transform silence into fertile soil. Accepting that misunderstanding is part of the way, but that this does not need to become bitterness. It is possible to live on the fringes of social life without feeling smaller, strange, or broken. On the contrary, it is there, on the bank, that you see the whole more clearly. Solitude, when well lived, allows us to listen clearly what the noise of the crowd tries to drown out. Who we are, what we think, what really matters. No wonder so many of the great creators of humanity cultivated this distance with love. They knew that between loneliness and suffering there is a point of balance, a place where thought breathes and the soul, finally, listens. In the end, the journey of the lone thinker is not only marked by the distance but by the lucidity he carries with him. Schopenhauer was neither the first nor the last to see society as a staging, a stage where masks multiply and the truth dissolves into conventions. But perhaps it was one of the few to assume this so clearly, even knowing the price. And that is why its philosophy resonates with such strength today. We live in a time when the noise is constant, not only external, but internal. Networks, commitments, the need to show, to assert themselves, to be accepted. In the midst of all this, stopping and listening to his own thought has become almost an act of rebellion. Solitude is no longer seen as creative space and has been treated as a failure, as a sign of social failure. But perhaps it is precisely the opposite. Perhaps, as Schopenhauer said, those who seek truth, depth, inner freedom cannot even fit the world totally. You may need to learn to walk in parallel, watching without dissolving, living without contaminating. It is not about rejecting each other, but of preserving the most rare, independence of thought. The lonely thinker in this scenario is not a lost hermit. He is a sentry, a guardian of lucidity in times of confusion. Its function is not to fit in, but remember the world that there are things that only flourish in silence. Ideas, visions, music, discoveries. None of this is born from the collective noise, but from the inner listening. This is Schopenhauer's legacy, and so many others who, when they choose the most lonely path, eventually illuminated the world with what they discovered alone. Solitude, for these minds, was not a burden that carried sadly. It was a tool, a strategy, a chance to go deeper. And it is in this depth that true transformation happens. The world will continue to be noisy, the masks will continue to be used, but it is up to each to decide whether to live immersed in this or be reserved, even for a moment, a space for conscious loneliness. Not as an escape, but as a form of freedom. Because sometimes it is only when we are truly alone that we can finally hear the truth that the world insists on silencing. If this content has touched something you live or feel, enjoy the video. It helps to bring this message to more people who also feel displaced in the noise of the world. If you value deep reflections and seek to better understand yourself and society, subscribe to the channel to keep up with more content like this. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, share. Sometimes a video like this can be the silence someone needed to reconnect with yourself. And of course, leave in the comments. How do you live your own loneliness? Does it weigh you or break free?